right way, and we'll just go right ahead. So we're going to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, which is coming up this October of 2022. And so just to just orient folks and remind you, if you don't know already, that the goal of the Clean Water Act has been to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. So it is a federal piece of legislation. We will talk a little bit specifically about how it relates to Kentucky, but just to drive home the point that this is a critical tool that we can use nationwide to ensure safe and healthy waters, and remind folks too, the effectiveness of the Clean Water Act really is increased when we have citizen awareness and engagement. So I mentioned the Kentucky specific part. So in Kentucky, our watersheds, our large watersheds, are also known as river basins. That's another way that we talk about them. And so you can look on this map and locate where you live and work, and you'll recognize all those river basins, I think. And so that's how the Division of Water, the Kentucky Division of Water, which is our state regulatory agency, that's how they start to kind of divide up and manage our water resources in the state, is on these river basin scales. And we do have a lot of water resources in Kentucky. If you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard or seen these facts shown as well. So we have over 90,000 miles of streams and rivers in the state, and over 440,000 acres of lakes. So that's a lot of water. It's a lot of surface water. Typically in Kentucky, though, our surface and our groundwater are intricately connected through our karst geology. And so what's on the ground is in our water, so to speak. So it's above ground, below ground, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. So we also have ways that we use water in Kentucky, and you'll see these little symbols later on in the presentation, but I just wanted to kind of go through what we as water folk call designated uses. And it's a little bit of a jargon, but this is all stuff that will make sense to you. So primary contact recreation is swimming or any kind of activity where you could be immersed in the water. Secondary contact recreation is when we maybe are fishing or boating. And so our water quality standards might not be quite as strict because we're probably not going to get that water, or we're less likely to get the water in our mouth. Aquatic life is where we're interested in the quality of the water to support wildlife, and specifically fish, mussels, as well as aquatic insects. Our domestic water supply is just what that sounds like, what water bodies we are getting municipal drinking water sources from. And then fish consumption is when we're concerned about contaminants like mercury and how that might affect those who are eating the fish. And predominantly, we're concerned about women of childbearing age, but also children and sometimes elderly populations. And then finally, another way that we look at our water resources in Kentucky are outstanding state resource waters, or OSRWs. And these are ones that are really high quality waters, or they have special or specific habitats that are maintained in those waterways. And they're ones that typically will focus on protecting. So all of these different uses and the way we use water in Kentucky will help us, and I say us in a general sense, but they help especially the regulatory agency kind of create a report card for what's going on in our streams and rivers and our water in the state. And we start to determine if our waters are healthy or not, or if they might need a little bit of assistance to be better. So getting back to the Clean Water Act, and give you a little bit of history. So the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948 was really our first major piece of legislation that was supposed to address water pollution. But it was a little vague, I would say, and there were really no defined goals or objectives or any kind of limits in terms of pollutants, or really much in terms of guidelines. And so it was there, but it was, left a bit to be desired. Along comes the 1950s and 60s, and there were some amendments that were made to the 1948 statute. We started to see more federal assistance toward folks and municipalities really that were discharging sewage. So a lot of it had to do with what we would call point sources of pollution. And I'll show you an image of that in just a minute. But sewage specifically was starting to be addressed, and how we could keep our wastewater out of our freshwater resources. There was some enforcement for those who were discharging. There also began to be included in the law this dealing with navigable intrastate waters. So not just between states, but within states. And then there were some water quality standards that were added in the mid-60s. However, there was this growing interest within society of environmental issues and more environmental awareness. And so there was a bit of frustration about how limiting or kind of lacking this legislation was. Also, kind of in that 1960s and late 50s, early 60s timeframe, we start to see some popular literature being available, and most specifically Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So that was published in 1962. Anybody who has thought about or considered environmental issues, I'm sure has heard of Silent Spring, and perhaps you've read that as well. But it was Rachel Carson's call to action and really wanted to call the public's attention to the fact that using insecticides was having a negative impact to wildlife, and specifically with bird populations. And so this book led to a nationwide ban on DDT for agricultural uses. And then also, in the late 60s, the paperback version of Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac came about. It had already been published in hardcover in the late 40s, but then the paperback edition seemed to get a little more traction, and folks start thinking about a land ethic and what that really means. And so lots of course, in this time too, we had a lot of social unrest, and just folks really paying attention to what was going on in their environment. And then cue in the Cuyahoga River. And so all these dates that are popping up on the screen, these are all years in which the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. And so newsflash, rivers aren't supposed to burn. But when you have pollution and discharges from industry that are discharging chemicals that are flammable, and what results is significant fires. And in 1969, there was a significant fire on the Cuyahoga River that was really kind of the tipping point for, hey, we've got to do a better job taking care of our water resources in the United States. And so in the early 1970 itself, the Environmental Protection Agency was created. Also in 1970, we have the first Earth Day that occurs. And so all of these things are kind of coming together and creating a lot of social demand and scientific demand and interest in having the Clean Water Act. And so the Clean Water Act, as we know it, was established in 1972. In October, I believe the official date is October 18th, 1972. So we're moving toward 50 years very quickly this year. And the two broad components that were included in that early Clean Water Act was federal assistance for municipal sewage treatment plants. So again, a focus on wastewater. And then it also provided regulatory requirements for industrial and municipal dischargers, and some water quality standards that were established. So this was like when we're actually looking at specific numbers and goals of what we think, kind of that report card thing of saying, where do we fall on the scale? Are our waters clean, and where should they hit with some of those parameters to be considered clean and healthy? So just for a second, I want to point out these categories of pollution, because this is kind of where the Clean Water Act kind of has two major parts. We think about point sources, which probably the early lessons that you've had about water quality really kind of relate back to point sources of pollution. Is there a pipe that I can identify and point to that says this is discharging sewage or some other contaminant into the water body. That's what it's very identifiable, single point and single source of pollution versus non-point source, which is a little less specific, and runoff can come from many places. So all the ways that we use our landscape impacts the quality of water that runs off of it. And so that non-point source means that there are lots of different contributors to water pollution. And so that's how I've learned to think about water quality and how we protect water resources. Are we looking for point sources of pollution, or are we looking for non-point sources? And most of my work falls under that non-point source. So goals of the 1972 Clean Water Act, again, like I said earlier, restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So that's really what we're trying to get at. We're trying to eliminate discharge of pollutants into navigable waters by 1985, achieve water quality that provides for protection and propagation of fish and wildlife and recreation, and then also prohibit the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. So that's where we're starting to put regulation and controls on industrial polluters. So think about, the early maybe textile mills, paper mills, things that were located near water bodies. They're using the river water for part of their industrial production, but then when they're finished with it and their processed water needs to be discharged somewhere, then they may have discharged it right back out into the river. So the Cuyahoga River was a good example of that. The Reedy River, I was recently in Greenville, South Carolina, and the Reedy River that runs through town there was also polluted locally by a lot of textile mills, and they talked about how it would just be a rainbow of colors. And now the state, the community has worked together to restore that river. But these are the kind of things that the act was focused on. And this achieving water quality to protect wildlife and preserve recreational opportunities, those have proven to be a little more difficult to achieve. And part of the one thing I want to also point out, and this is kind of where we start to get a little bit of conflict among users and interest groups, is, well, like, what do we consider to be a water or a water body of the United States that would fall under the Clean Water Act and be subject to regulation? And so that's really where some of that, you've probably heard of WOTUS, people talking about waters of the US, and those are really points of ongoing conflict, is resistance to regulatory implication versus that interest in a more comprehensive interpretation of the water bodies that qualify for protection. And that's an ongoing discussion even still today. Now, in Kentucky, we have specified what it means to be a water of the Commonwealth. So in Kentucky, like I mentioned, Kentucky Division of Water is the regulatory arm for enforcing the Clean Water Act here in the state. And so they have then clarified what it means to be a water of the Commonwealth. And so it's a pretty broad definition. Any and all rivers, streams, creeks, lakes, ponds, impounding reservoirs, springs, wells, marshes, and all other bodies of surface or underground water, natural or artificial, situated wholly or partly within or bordering upon the Commonwealth or within its jurisdiction. So that's a pretty wide definition of waters of the Commonwealth. And so that's where we can get into trouble. Industry, sometimes agriculture, municipalities, is if we are in a situation where we are polluting the waters of the Commonwealth. So we're always looking for those best management practices that we can use on the farm, in the forest, in town, in our communities, so that we're protecting the waters of the Commonwealth. So again, remember, those categories of pollution could be a point source or a non-point source. So that you can kind of see now how non-point source really kind of gets tricky to implement. So managing point sources is a little easier. We can point to those pipes. We can identify industry that may be discharging water or processed water into a water body, and they're required to have a permit. And that permit is renewed every 5 years, and it kind of gives them a prescription for how much they can discharge. And so there's monitoring that has to be done there. With non-point sources, much more difficult to manage. So the sources are hard to identify. You know, if you see sediment, or you see kind of a muddy stream of water that's flowing into a bigger water body, it may be hard to tell where that sediment is coming from. It could be a construction site. It could be bare ground in a neighborhood. It could be an ag operation. It could be lots of different things, and it could be more than one thing. So that's really hard to manage. So kind of getting back to, like, how do we know what the quality of water is in Kentucky? We have, on a 2-year cycle, we have to report back to Congress what the quality of water is within Kentucky. And so you can find that in the integrated report. That's what the Kentucky Division of Water calls that report that they send to Congress every 2 years. And it pulls together the monitoring that they as a state agency do, as well as that kind of measurement of, you know, are our streams healthy or not? And so they create, they have a really nice new tool. It's a dashboard. Now, I know that that's relative because I'm kind of a science geek here. And so I look at these maps, I'm like, oh, this is an exciting way to look, a visual representation of some of this data. I'll click in a little closer there. So take a note of the map of Kentucky, and you see all those red, yellow, and green squiggles on there. And those are all of our streams that have been monitored, and that's the database. There's also this Kentucky Water Health Portal. I think as an individual, this is probably the best interface. You can just Google Kentucky Water Health Portal, and you can select if you know the name of your stream that you live by, you can select a spring, a lake, and you can also search by address. And so you can find the name of the creek that you live closest to and find out when it was monitored most recently and what the quality of that water is from that monitoring. And so these little squiggles kind of follow the stoplight concept, meaning if it's green, you're good to go. So quality, high quality water, and you're meeting the designated use. So remember that primary contact recreation or aquatic habitat or drinking water. So if it's green, it means you're good to go. If it's yellow, it means it might not be meeting one of its designated uses. And if it's red, then that means it's impaired. And so there is something going on. And so as a water manager, we can look at that and go, gracious, there's something going on in those water bodies. What can we do on the landscape to help improve water quality? So, and I wanted to point out too that the 3 major pollutants that we deal with here in Kentucky are primarily sediment. So that's soil that is either running off from bare ground, or a lot of times it's sloughing off of a stream bank. So it's scouring a stream bank and depositing into the stream. Pathogens, we're talking about E. coli, fecal coliform, things that may come from, you know, those pathogens that are things that could get into our bodies and make us sick. And so that's a big concern. And then also we have nutrients in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus that are real problems for our water resources. Now, not all doom and gloom. So I want to make sure that I share with you that we have ways that we can be good managers of our landscape. And so my favorite one, of course, are stream buffers. And we can show how we can have trees, shrubs, and a variety of vegetation on the stream bank that will help hold soil in place. Can also, with those buffers, we can prevent direct access from other animals that might get into the stream, like livestock, that could contribute nutrient or pathogen pollutants into the water. But to have healthy buffers, it's going to help us have healthy water. And when we're talking about forestry operations, we're really thinking about SMZs, or those stream side management zones. So if we're going to do a harvest, these are the practices we're going to use, and it's in turn going to protect water resources. So Finally, just to wrap up, a few ways that you can get involved if you want to know more about the Clean Water Act. This might be all that you ever want to know about the Clean Water Act, but remember, we said the Clean Water Act is most effective when we have involvement from our citizens. So providing public comment is a way to do that. So find out if there are permits being issued. The state always puts those out for public comment and review. You can sign up for email notifications from the Kentucky Division of Water. You can learn more about your local water bodies through that Kentucky Water Health portal that I showed you. Also, you might be interested in being a volunteer water monitor through Watershed Watch. And then finally, ensuring that clean water is a focal point for you, your family, and your community. You can do that by using best management practices and also recruiting others to get involved with you as well. And so I'll stop there. If you have questions, you can reach out to me. I do want to take a moment to recognize Melissa McAllister. I borrowed a lot of her slides for this program and this presentation. She is the Kentucky River Basin Coordinator. So each of those major river basins that I talked about earlier have a coordinator. And so you can find those folks